The tears wouldn't stop falling as Adelaide Montgomery knelt before the freshly turned earth, her gloved fingers tracing the crude, wooden cross bearing her father's name. Whispers of an early spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the small churchyard in Cottonwood Springs, but she found no comfort in nature's gentle awakening. Not when her world had collapsed, just 3 days prior, when the consumption that had plagued Thomas Montgomery for months finally claimed him, leaving his 22-year-old daughter utterly alone in the unforgiving frontier of 1876 Wyoming Territory. "I don't know what to do without you, Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking as another sob escaped her lips. The black morning dress her father's housekeeper had altered for her felt restrictive, the collar too tight against her throat as she struggled to breathe through her grief. "You promised we would have more time." Adelaide had abandoned her teaching position in Boston the moment her father's letters began mentioning his worsening cough. She'd arrived in Cottonwood Springs just 2 weeks ago, barely enough time to reconnect with the man who had left the East to seek his fortune in silver mining years before. They'd had so little time together before the disease took him completely. Now she sat alone, a stranger in a rough town on the edge of civilization, with nothing but a small cabin filled with her father's meager possessions, and a mining claim that had never yielded the riches he'd hoped for. She was so lost in her grief that she didn't notice the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the grave. Adelaide startled, hastily wiping at her tear-stained cheeks as she glanced up. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his weather-worn hat. Dust clung to his denim trousers and the leather chaps that covered them. The revolver holstered at his hip caught the afternoon sunlight. A cowboy, one of many who passed through Cottonwood Springs with the cattle herds, though something about his stance suggested permanence rather than the transient nature of most cowboys she'd glimpsed since her arrival. "Beggin' your pardon, miss," he said, his voice deep but gentle as he removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Adelaide quickly rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "You're not disturbing me, sir." "I was just—" Her voice faltered as fresh tears threatened. "Saying goodbye," he finished for her, his blue eyes reflecting an understanding that suggested personal knowledge of such loss. "Thomas Montgomery was a good man. I'm right sorry for your trouble. You knew my father." Adelaide asked, surprised. The cowboy nodded, shifting his weight slightly. "Yes, madam. Name's Jake Callahan. I've got a small spread about 5 miles outside of town. Your father helped me once when my horse threw a shoe near his claim. Wouldn't take payment neither, just said to remember him if I ever struck silver." A faint smile touched his lips. "I never did find silver, but I remembered him just the same." Adelaide managed a weak nod, grateful for this small connection to her father's life here, a life she knew so little about. "You must be the daughter from back east," Jake continued. "He spoke of you often, mighty proud of his schoolteacher girl." The mention of her father's pride broke something inside Adelaide, and she couldn't prevent the fresh wave of tears. She turned away, embarrassed by her display of emotion before a stranger. "I apologize," she murmured, fumbling for her handkerchief. "No need for that," Jake said quietly. To her surprise, he didn't retreat from her grief. Instead, he settled his hat back on his head and moved to stand beside her, facing the grave. "Mind if I pay my respects while you finish yours?" Adelaide shook her head, oddly comforted by his presence as they stood in silence before her father's final resting place. The churchyard was otherwise empty, the small white clapboard building behind them quiet on this weekday afternoon. The distant sounds of the town, a hammer striking metal at the blacksmith's, the occasional shout or laugh from the saloon seemed to emphasize their isolation in this small patch of hallowed ground. Minutes passed. Adelaide's tears gradually subsided, though the ache in her chest remained. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier. "I arrived too late. He was already so ill, he could barely recognize me at the end." Jake remained silent for a moment before responding. "Last time I saw him, about a month back, he was talking about how he'd sent for you." Said it was the only right thing, you coming home to Wyoming rather than him returning east. This was his home. But not mine, Adelaide whispered. I don't belong here. Jake turned to face her then. The compassion in his eyes held no pity, only a genuine understanding that made her feel less alone. Belonging takes time, Miss Montgomery. Sometimes it finds you when you're not looking for it. They fell silent again, watching as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the churchyard. Adelaide found herself drawing strange comfort from this quiet cowboy who seemed content to stand vigil with her without expectation or demand. Have you decided what you'll do now? He finally asked. Adelaide sighed, the question bringing forth all the uncertainties she'd been avoiding. I'm not sure. Return to Boston, I suppose, though there's nothing waiting for me there either. My teaching position has surely been filled by now. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Your father's claim is worthless, according to Mr. Whitaker at the assay office, Adelaide finished. He offered to buy it for a pittance, more out of charity than interest, I suspect. Whitaker's been trying to buy up every inch of that hillside for years, Jake remarked, a note of suspicion in his voice. Might be worth having another opinion before you sell. Adelaide glanced at him, curious about his tone but too emotionally exhausted to question further. The setting sun was casting long shadows now, reminding her of how long she'd been at the grave. I should return to the cabin before dark, she said, reluctantly preparing to leave her father's side. Jake shifted, looking suddenly uncertain. Miss Montgomery, I know it's not my place, but it ain't proper for a lady to be staying alone out at that claim, especially in times of grief. Adelaide bristled slightly. I have no alternative, Mr. Callahan. I'm perfectly capable, I don't doubt your capability, he interrupted gently. But there are elements in this town that don't hold to civilized behavior, particularly when it comes to a woman alone. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Mrs. Evans at the boarding house has a spare room. She was a friend to your father. Might be a better arrangement, at least until you decide your next steps. Part of Adelaide wanted to reject his suggestion outright, this stranger presuming to advise her, but the genuine concern in his expression gave her pause. She had, in truth, felt uneasy alone in the isolated cabin the past 2 nights. I'll consider it, she conceded. Jake nodded, apparently satisfied. He looked once more at Thomas Montgomery's grave, then touched the brim of his hat respectfully. I'll leave you to your goodbyes, Miss Montgomery. Adelaide expected him to depart then, but he surprised her by adding, if you don't mind, I'd be pleased to escort you back to town afterward. My horse is hitched outside the church. The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. That's very kind, Mr. Callahan. He didn't immediately walk away, instead hesitating as if wanting to say something more. Finally, he simply nodded again and moved a respectful distance away, giving her privacy for her final moments at the grave while still remaining within sight. Adelaide knelt once more, placing her hand on the freshly turned earth. Goodbye, Papa, she whispered. I'll try to be brave like you always taught me. As she rose and turned away from the grave, she noticed Jake Callahan waiting patiently by the churchyard gate, his tall figure silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun. Something about his steadfast presence made her feel a little less adrift in her sea of grief. For the first time that day, Adelaide felt the smallest flicker of something other than despair, perhaps not hope, not yet, but the faintest suggestion that she might eventually find her way through this darkness. She approached him, her steps hesitant but determined. I'm ready, Mr. Callahan. He offered his arm with a courtly gesture that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. It would be my honor, Miss Montgomery. As they walked together toward his waiting horse, Adelaide realized the tears had finally stopped. It wasn't a smile, she couldn't imagine smiling again anytime soon, but perhaps it was the first step toward healing. Jake's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, nickered softly as they approached. This is Samson, Jake introduced, patting the animal's neck. He's steady as they come. Adelaide reached out tentatively to stroke the horse's velvety muzzle. He's beautiful. He knows it too, Jake replied with a hint of amusement. Makes him insufferable sometimes. The small jest surprised a faint, fleeting smile from Adelaide so brief she hardly recognized it herself. Jake noticed, though, his eyes warming at the sight. He helped her mount, his hands respectful as he boosted her onto the saddle. Once she was settled, he swung up behind her with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Adelaide stiffened slightly at the unexpected proximity, but as Samson began to walk toward town, she found herself gradually relaxing against Jake's solid presence. The brief ride into Cottonwood Springs gave Adelaide time to consider her options. The idea of the boarding house held more appeal the more she thought about it. The isolation of her father's cabin, once a comfort in her grief, now seemed daunting as night approached. "Mrs. Evans is a good woman," Jake commented as they rode past the general store. "Lost her husband in the war. Understands sorrow better than most. You seem to know everyone in town," Adelaide observed. Jake guided Samson around a muddy patch in the road. "Not by choice, necessarily. Small towns don't leave much room for anonymity. And yet you choose to live here rather than on your ranch." "My foreman handles the day-to-day operations. I come into town regular for supplies and to handle business matters." He paused. "Truth be told, I prefer the open country, but a man can't live entirely apart from civilization." They arrived at the boarding house, a two-story structure with a neat front porch adorned with potted geraniums. Jake dismounted first, then reached up to help Adelaide down. Her legs felt unsteady after the ride, or perhaps from the emotional exhaustion of the day. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she said formally as her feet touched the ground. "For your kindness at the churchyard and for the escort." Jake kept his hat in his hands. "Miss Montgomery, if you'll permit me to say so, grief has a way of isolating a person. Sometimes the kindness of even a stranger can be a lifeline." The words struck Adelaide with unexpected force. She looked up at him, really seeing him clearly for the first time. His face was weathered from years under the western sun, but his eyes held a gentleness that contrasted with his rugged exterior. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, though life on the frontier aged a person differently than in the sheltered world she'd known. "You speak as though you know this from experience," she said quietly. A shadow passed over his features. "I do." He didn't elaborate, and Adelaide didn't press. The door of the boarding house opened, and a plump woman with silver-streaked hair appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Callahan, and this must be Thomas Montgomery's daughter. Come in, child, come in. I've just put supper on the table." Jake nodded respectfully to the woman. "Evening, Mrs. Evans. Miss Montgomery may be looking for accommodation." "Of course she is," Mrs. Evans declared as if it had been decided long ago. "I've had the corner room ready since I heard Thomas took a turn for the worse. Come in, dear." "You look about ready to collapse." Adelaide hesitated, glancing back at Jake. "Mrs. Evans will take good care of you," he assured her. "I'll check on your father's cabin periodically, make sure everything's secure." "That's very thoughtful," Adelaide said, touched by his consideration. "I don't know how to thank you for your kindness today, Mr. Callahan." "No thanks needed." He settled his hat back on his head. "If you need anything at all, most folks in town know where to find me." As Jake mounted Samson and rode away, Adelaide felt a curious mixture of emotions. Grief still dominated, but somewhere beneath it stirred something unfamiliar, a sense that perhaps she wasn't as alone in this strange place as she had believed. Mrs. Evans ushered her inside with motherly efficiency, chattering about hot food and a warm bath. For the first time since her father's passing, Adelaide felt a tiny fragment of the crushing weight lift from her shoulders. Perhaps she could survive this after all. Later that evening, after a simple but nourishing meal and the luxury of a hot bath, Adelaide sat by the window of her new room, watching the stars appear over the rugged Wyoming landscape. She thought of her father, of the life he had built here, so different from their former existence in the East. And almost despite herself, she found her thoughts drifting to Jake Callahan, the cowboy who had stood vigil with her in her darkest moment. "I met someone today who knew you, Papa," she whispered to the night sky. "A kind man who didn't walk away from a stranger's tears." The stars offered no reply, but as Adelaide prepared for bed, she realized the painful tightness in her chest had eased slightly. Grief still enveloped her, but something else had entered her world today, something that felt, if not quite like hope, then perhaps like its distant cousin. The following morning brought a clarity Adelaide hadn't expected. After a night of surprisingly restful sleep in the comfortable bed at Mrs. Evans's boarding house, she awoke with resolve. She would stay in Cottonwood Springs, at least until she could properly settle her father's affairs and decide her future path with a clearer mind. After a hearty breakfast of sourdough biscuits and eggs, Adelaide ventured into town. Cottonwood Springs was a modest settlement that had sprung up to service the surrounding ranches and the small mining operations in the nearby hills. A single main street boasted the essential businesses general store, blacksmith, assay office, bank, 2 saloons, and the small church where her father's funeral had been held. It wasn't Boston, with its cobblestone streets and gas lamps, but there was a certain honest directness to the place that Adelaide found herself appreciating. Her first stop was the assay office. Mr. Whitaker, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown, seemed surprised to see her. "Miss Montgomery, I wasn't expecting you so soon after your father's passing," he said, motioning her to a chair opposite his cluttered desk. "My condolences again for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I've come about my father's mining claim." The assayer nodded. "Yes, as I mentioned at the funeral, I'm prepared to offer $50 for the claim. A courtesy, really, as I'm afraid your father's tunnel showed little promise." Adelaide folded her hands in her lap. "Mr. Callahan suggested I might seek another opinion before selling." Whitaker's expression soured noticeably. "Callahan, I wasn't aware you were acquainted with him. We met yesterday. He knew my father." "I see." Whitaker removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "Miss Montgomery, while I respect Jake Callahan's abilities as a rancher, he knows very little about mining. I've been the assayer in this town for 15 years. Your father's claim has been thoroughly evaluated." Adelaide considered this. "Nevertheless, I think I'll hold off on any decisions for the time being. My father believed in that claim. I'd like to understand why before I part with it." Whitaker replaced his spectacles, his mouth tightening. "As you wish, but I should warn you that offer won't remain open indefinitely. There are development opportunities in those hills that won't wait forever." Adelaide stood, thanking him for his time. As she left the office, she wondered about Whitaker's reaction to Jake's name. There seemed to be some history there, perhaps the natural tension between mining and ranching interests that her father had mentioned in his letters. Her next stop was the general store, where she needed to purchase a few necessities. The storekeeper, a jovial man named Peterson, greeted her warmly. "Miss Montgomery, how are you settling in at Mrs. Evans's place?" Adelaide smiled politely, unsurprised that news traveled quickly in such a small community. "Very well, thank you." As she selected items, paper and ink, a few toiletries, a new hairbrush to replace one forgotten in Boston, Peterson chatted about local happenings. Adelaide was only half listening until she heard Jake's name mentioned. "Pardon me," she said. "What was that about Mr. Callahan?" Peterson looked up from the order he was tallying. "Oh, just that he's headed out to the Circle C today. His foreman rode in early this morning with news about some trouble with the spring calving. Sounds like he'll be out there for a few days at least." Adelaide felt a strange twinge of disappointment. She had found herself looking forward to perhaps seeing Jake again to thank him properly for his kindness. The realization unsettled her slightly. "I see," she said, refocusing on her purchases. "Could you add a small bag of peppermint candies?" Mrs. Evans mentioned they're her favorite. After completing her errands, Adelaide decided to visit her father's cabin. She needed to inventory his belongings and collect any personal items she might want to keep. The walk was longer than she remembered, the cabin situated about a mile outside of town along a winding dirt road that followed a small creek. The sight of the modest structure brought a fresh wave of grief. It was a simple log cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by a few scraggly pine trees. A small shed stood nearby, housing her father's mining equipment. The hillside behind the cabin was marked by the entrance to the tunnel he had been working for the past 2 years, now dark and forbidding. Adelaide used the key Mrs. Evans had given her apparently. Her father had left a spare with the boarding house proprietress and entered the silent cabin. It smelled of pine, leather, and faintly of the tobacco her father had enjoyed in his pipe. The main room contained a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small cast iron stove, and a bookshelf holding her father's modest collection of books. A doorway led to a tiny bedroom where a narrow cot was nearly made with a patchwork quilt. For the next few hours, Adelaide sorted through her father's possessions. There wasn't much: some clothing, tools, a few photographs including one of Adelaide as a young girl with her mother, who had passed away years earlier. In a small wooden box, she found letters she had written to him over the years, carefully preserved. The discovery brought fresh tears, but these were gentler, touched with love rather than only raw grief. As the afternoon waned, Adelaide sat at the table, leafing through a leather-bound journal she had discovered under her father's mattress. It appeared to be a record of his mining activities, with notations about rock formations, veins of ore, and calculations of potential yields. Much of it was technical and beyond her understanding, but his enthusiasm shone through in the careful diagrams and hopeful projections. The last few entries, dated just before his illness had confined him to bed, contained references to a new discovery. "Found promising quartz veining in the northwest face," he had written. "Different from previous formations. Samples set aside for assay, but Whittaker's been delaying. Something feels different about this one. Could this finally be it?" Adelaide frowned, wondering why Whittaker would delay testing samples that might prove valuable. It seemed contrary to his interest in purchasing the claim. She made a mental note to investigate further, perhaps ask Mrs. Evans if she knew of another assayer in the region. As she was preparing to leave, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Apprehension flickered through her. Jake's warning about being alone at the cabin suddenly seemed more prudent than overprotective. She moved cautiously to the window, relief washing over her when she recognized the buckskin gelding and its rider. Adelaide opened the door as Jake dismounted. He looked tired, a layer of dust covering his clothing suggesting he'd been riding hard. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted him. "I thought you'd be at your ranch. Mr. Peterson mentioned trouble with the calving." Jake removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "I was headed there, but thought I'd check on the cabin first, make sure everything was secure." He seemed surprised to find her there. "Didn't expect to find you here alone, Miss Montgomery." Adelaide smiled faintly. "I needed to sort through my father's belongings. It seemed a task best done in solitude." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "How are you finding things at Mrs. Evans's boarding house?" "She's been very kind." "The accommodations are comfortable." Adelaide hesitated, then added, "Would you like to come in? I could make coffee. It's the least I can offer for your thoughtfulness in checking on the property." Jake glanced at the position of the sun, then nodded. "Coffee would be welcome, thank you. I've got a bit of daylight left before I need to reach the Circle C." Adelaide busied herself with the coffee pot while Jake settled at the table, his large frame making the small cabin seem even more compact. She was acutely aware of his presence in a way that both unsettled and intrigued her. "I visited Mr. Whittaker this morning," she said as she set the pot on the stove. "He seemed displeased when I mentioned your suggestion about seeking another opinion on the claim." Jake's expression hardened slightly. "Whittaker and I have had our differences over the years. May I ask about what?" He considered her question before answering. "Whittaker represents mining interests that would like to see more of this area opened up for large-scale operations. Men like me, with established ranches, stand in the way of that vision. And my father's claim sits on land that connects several existing mining operations. A strategic piece, you might say." Adelaide brought 2 cups of coffee to the table, setting one before Jake. "In my father's journal, he mentioned Whittaker delaying the assay of some samples." Samples my father seemed quite excited about. Jake's eyebrows rose as he took a sip of the strong coffee. "That's so. Interesting timing with him now eager to buy the claim." They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the implications hanging between them. "Mr. Callahan," Adelaide finally said, "would you know of another assayer I might consult, someone not connected to Mr. Whittaker?" Jake set down his cup. "There's a man in Laramie about 2 days' ride from here. Well-respected, honest." I could arrange for some samples to be taken to him when my foreman heads that way next week." "I would be most grateful," Adelaide said. She hesitated, then added, "I found some samples in a small box marked Northwest Face. They might be what my father was referring to in his journal." Jake nodded. "I'll make sure they get to Laramie safely." As they finished their coffee, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Jake told her about his ranch, the Circle C, named for his family name and the creek that ran through the property. He'd built it from almost nothing over the past 8 years, starting with just a few head of cattle and gradually expanding, until it was now one of the more successful operations in the region. "It's not the biggest spread," he said with a hint of pride, "but the land's good and I've got a solid crew. We manage." Adelaide found herself sharing stories of her life in Boston, her teaching position at a girls' school, the world she had left behind. Jake listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a keen intelligence behind his frontier exterior. As the shadows lengthened outside, Jake reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get to the ranch before full dark. My foreman's capable, but I like to see problems firsthand." Adelaide walked him to the door. "Thank you again for checking on the cabin and for listening." Jake settled his hat on his head. "Sometimes that's what folks need most, someone to listen." He paused, seeming to debate something internally before adding, "I should be back in town by Sunday. If you're amenable, perhaps you'd join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant. They serve a decent meal, and it might be a welcome change from Mrs. Evans's cooking, good as it is." The invitation caught Adelaide by surprise. It wasn't exactly a social call, more a kindness to a newcomer, but it stirred a warmth in her chest nonetheless. "I would like that," she answered honestly. Jake's smile transformed his weathered face, softening the lines around his eyes. "Sunday at 6, then." He tipped his hat and strode to where Sampson waited patiently. Adelaide watched as he rode away, the golden light of late afternoon gilding horse and rider as they disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did she realize that, for the first time since her father's death, she had gone several hours without the crushing weight of grief overwhelming her. It wasn't gone, the loss still ached like a physical wound, but somehow, in Jake Callahan's steady presence, she had found moments of respite. And with them, the first fragile tendrils of what might someday grow into healing. Adelaide stayed at the cabin until sunset, securing the door carefully before making her way back to town. The walk gave her time to sort through her thoughts and emotions. The discovery of her father's journal entries about the promising samples added a new dimension to her situation. If there truly was something valuable in his claim, she needed to know before making any decisions about selling. But beyond that practical concern, Adelaide found her mind returning to Jake Callahan. There was something about the cowboy that intrigued her, a depth behind his straightforward manner, a kindness that seemed to come naturally rather than from obligation. In Boston, she had occasionally received attention from men in her social circle, teachers at the boys' academy, sons of her father's former colleagues, but none had affected her the way this brief acquaintance with Jake had. Perhaps it was simply the circumstances, she reasoned. Grief made one vulnerable, and kindness in such moments could seem magnified. Yet she couldn't dismiss the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of Sunday's dinner. The days passed slowly yet purposefully. Adelaide continued sorting through her father's affairs, discovering that his financial situation, while not desperate, was more precarious than she'd realized. The small savings account at the Cottonwood Springs Bank would cover immediate expenses, but not much more. The future of the mining claim took on greater importance with this knowledge. Mrs. Evans proved to be not just a landlady, but a friend. The older woman shared stories of Thomas Montgomery's life in Cottonwood Springs, filling in gaps in Adelaide's knowledge of her father's years in the West. Through these conversations, Adelaide began to understand why he had chosen to remain here rather than return east after his initial mining venture. "Your father loved the openness of this country," Mrs. Evans told her as they shelled peas on the boarding house porch. "Said he felt like he could breathe out here in a way he never could back east. Too many rules there, too many people judging a man by his family name or the cut of his coat rather than the content of his character." Adelaide could understand that sentiment. Even in her short time in Cottonwood Springs, she'd noticed how people were assessed by their actions and words rather than their pedigree. It was refreshingly direct, if occasionally disconcerting. On Friday, Adelaide decided to attend the small gathering at the church. It wasn't a formal service, just a prayer meeting that the minister, Reverend Holloway, held weekly. She felt drawn to the churchyard where her father rested, finding comfort in the peaceful setting. After the brief service, she lingered by her father's grave, now marked with a more permanent wooden cross that the Reverend had crafted. The raw earth was beginning to settle, and someone, Mrs. Evans, perhaps had planted a small rosebush nearby. Miss Montgomery. The Reverend's gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. "It's good to see you here." Adelaide smiled at the elderly minister. "Thank you for the beautiful cross, Reverend, and for your kindness at the funeral. Your father was well respected in our community." A quiet man, but generous in his own way. He paused, studying her face. "How are you finding our little town? Different from Boston," she admitted, "but not unpleasantly so. People have been kind." The Reverend nodded. "I understand Jake Callahan has been particularly attentive." Adelaide felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Callahan has been neighborly, yes. He knew my father. Jake is one of the good ones," Reverend Holloway said with a gentle smile. "Not a regular churchgoer, mind you, but a man who lives by a moral code as strict as any I preach from the pulpit." He patted her hand. "Should you need anything at all, my door is always open." As Adelaide walked back to the boarding house, she pondered the Reverend's words about Jake. It was clear he was well regarded in the community, despite Whittaker's apparent animosity. She found herself increasingly curious about the man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her time of need. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a warmth that hinted at the approaching summer. Adelaide spent more time than usual preparing for the evening, selecting her least somber dress, a deep blue that her father had always said matched her eyes, and arranging her chestnut hair in a simple but flattering style. Mrs. Evans noticed her care and smiled knowingly, but made no comment. Jake arrived at the boarding house precisely at 6, freshly shaven and wearing a clean white shirt under a dark vest. His usual trail dust was nowhere to be seen, and his dark hair was neatly combed. The transformation from rugged cowboy to presentable dinner companion was striking, though Adelaide found she appreciated both versions equally. "Miss Montgomery," he greeted her, hat in hand. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan, and thank you for the invitation." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Cottonwood Springs, which wasn't saying much by Eastern standards, but represented a genuine attempt at elegance on the frontier. White cloths covered the tables, and actual glass windows replaced the oiled paper commonly used in many of the town's buildings. As they were seated, Adelaide noticed several curious glances from other diners. Clearly, Jake Callahan dining with the newcomer from the East was worthy of notice in the small community. "I hope you don't mind being the subject of local interest," Jake said, noticing her awareness of the attention. "Small towns run on gossip the way cities run on coal," Adelaide smiled. "I taught at a girls' school, Mr. Callahan. I'm well acquainted with how quickly news travels." Their conversation flowed easily over a meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh spring vegetables. Jake told her about the calving difficulties at his ranch twins that had required intervention, while Adelaide shared anecdotes from her teaching days. They discovered a mutual love of reading, though Jake admitted his library was modest compared to what she must be accustomed to. "My father always valued education," he explained. "Made sure I had access to books even when we were moving from place to place. He was a restless man, never staying anywhere long until we reached Wyoming Territory." "And you decided to put down roots where he couldn't," Adelaide observed. Jake nodded, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. "He died before I established the Circle C. Pneumonia, winter of '68. I think he would have approved, though, of me finding a place that felt like home." The shared experience of loss created a deeper connection between them. Adelaide found herself opening up about her own grief, the complicated emotions of having been separated from her father for so many years only to lose him so soon after reuniting. The hardest part, she confessed, is wondering if I truly knew him. The man who raised me in Boston seems different from the one people describe here. People contain multitudes, Jake said thoughtfully. The West changes a person, strips away pretenses. Maybe what you're hearing about is the man your father became when he could fully be himself. It was a profound observation that gave Adelaide much to consider. Their conversation continued, touching on lighter topics as the evening progressed. Jake mentioned that his foreman would be heading to Laramie in 2 days and offered to collect the samples from her father's cabin the following morning. "I've been thinking," Adelaide said as they finished their coffee. "I'd like to see the claim myself, to understand what my father was working on. Would you consider showing me the tunnel entrance? I know the general location, but I'm not familiar with mining operations." Jake considered her request. "I could do that, but tunnels can be dangerous, especially abandoned ones. We'd need to be cautious." "I trust your judgment," Adelaide said, surprising herself with how true the statement felt. The evening concluded with Jake escorting her back to the boarding house. The spring night was cool but pleasant, the streets of Cottonwood Springs quiet except for the muted sounds from the saloons. At the boarding house steps, Jake turned to face her. "Thank you for your company this evening, Miss Montgomery. It was the most enjoyable dinner I've had in quite some time." Adelaide smiled up at him, aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee she'd consumed. "I enjoyed it as well, Mr. Callahan, very much." Jake hesitated, then reached for her hand, holding it gently in his larger one. "Adelaide," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I know your time here has been marked by loss. But I hope you're finding that Cottonwood Springs has something to offer beyond memories of your father." The sincerity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "I believe I am, Jake," she replied, reciprocating the familiarity. He smiled, lifting her hand briefly to his lips in a gesture that was old-fashioned but somehow perfectly suited to the moment. "Good night, then. I'll call for you tomorrow morning around 10 if that suits." "That would be perfect." Adelaide watched him walk away, a tall figure in the moonlight, before entering the boarding house. Mrs. Evans, who had clearly been waiting up, pretended to be occupied with mending but couldn't hide her curious smile. "I take it the dinner was pleasant?" she inquired innocently. Adelaide laughed softly. "Very pleasant indeed, Mrs. Evans." That night, as she prepared for bed, Adelaide realized something significant had shifted within her. The grief remained, a shadow that would likely never fully disappear, but alongside it now existed something new, a tentative anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. For the first time since arriving in Cottonwood Springs, she found herself looking forward rather than backward. The morning dawned bright and clear, perfect for their expedition to the mining claim. Adelaide dressed practically in her simplest skirt and a sturdy shirtwaist, with boots she'd purchased at the general store that were better suited to the rugged terrain than her Eastern footwear. Jake arrived promptly at 10, leading not only Samson but also a gentle-looking bay mare. "Thought you might prefer your own mount," he explained. "This is Daisy. She belongs to the livery stable owner's daughter who's away visiting relatives, sweet-tempered and sure-footed." Adelaide approached the mare, stroking her velvet nose. "She's lovely. It's been some time since I've ridden, though." "Daisy will compensate for any rustiness," Jake assured her, "and it's not a difficult trail to the claim." With Jake's assistance, Adelaide mounted, finding the side saddle more comfortable than she'd expected. They set off at an easy pace, following the creek that ran past her father's cabin and then continuing up into the foothills beyond. The day was pleasantly warm, the Wyoming spring in full bloom with wildflowers dotting the landscape in splashes of color. Jake pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the region, including the origins of Cottonwood Springs itself, originally a stopping point for wagon trains, before becoming a permanent settlement with the discovery of silver in the surrounding hills. "Most of the easy silver was found and mined out years ago," he explained as they rode. "What's left requires more sophisticated operations, or, like your father was doing, painstaking individual effort following veins deep into the rock. They reached the cabin by mid-morning. After securing the horses, Jake collected the tools he'd brought: lanterns, a small pick, sample bags, while Adelaide retrieved the box of samples her father had set aside. "These are what he marked as promising," she said, showing Jake the chunks of quartz-laced rock. Jake examined them carefully. "I'm no expert, but I can see why he was interested. There's definitely mineralization here." He carefully packed the samples into his saddlebag. "Now, let's take a look at that tunnel." The mine entrance was set into the hillside about 100 yards behind the cabin, shored up with timber supports. Jake inspected these carefully before lighting the lanterns. "Seems solid enough, but we won't go too far in. Just enough to see what your father was working on." Adelaide nodded, both nervous and eager as they entered the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately, the air taking on a damp, earthy smell. The lantern light created dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as they moved deeper into the mountain. Jake pointed out features as they went: a vein of quartz running through the darker rock, tool marks where her father had chipped away at the stone, the remnants of blasting work where he'd expanded the tunnel. "Your father was methodical," Jake observed. "This is careful work." They reached a point where the tunnel branched, one path continuing straight while another veered to the northwest. Jake consulted the small compass he carried, then gestured to the northwest passage. This would be where he found those samples, according to his journal. The northwest passage was narrower, clearly newer work. They proceeded carefully, Jake testing the support beams as they went. About 50 feet in, the tunnel opened slightly into a small chamber where the rock face showed clear signs of recent excavation. Jake held his lantern higher, examining the wall. This must be where he was working last. He ran his hand along the rock face, tracing a line of pale quartz embedded in the darker stone. "See this vein? It's widening here. And these flecks," he pointed to tiny metallic specks catching the light. "Could be promising." Adelaide studied the rock face, trying to see it through her father's eyes. Had he stood in this very spot, heart racing with the possibility of the fortune that had eluded him for so long? The thought created a powerful connection across the divide of death. "Could you take a few samples from here?" she asked. "To send to the assayer in Laramie," Jake nodded, using his pick to carefully chip away several chunks of the quartz-bearing rock. As he worked, a slight rumble vibrated through the tunnel, causing small particles of dust to drift down from the ceiling. Jake immediately straightened, expression alert. "We should head back. That could be natural settling, but I don't want to take chances." They retreated more quickly than they had entered, emerging into the sunshine with a shared sense of relief. Mining tunnels were unpredictable, as they both knew, and safety was never guaranteed. Back in the fresh air, Jake carefully labeled and packed the new samples with the ones Adelaide had provided. "My foreman will make sure these reach Laramie safely. It might be a week or so before we hear back." They shared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples that Mrs. Evans had packed for them, sitting on the porch of the cabin. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd visited, and their differing experiences of life in the East versus the West. "Do you miss Boston?" Jake asked as they finished their meal. Adelaide considered the question seriously. "I miss certain aspects: the libraries, the theaters, the convenience of city life, but there's something compelling about this place too. A directness, a sense of possibility," she smiled. "And the sky, I've never seen such an expanse of sky." "That's what got me too," Jake admitted. "First time I saw a Wyoming sunset, I knew I'd found home." As they prepared to ride back to town, Adelaide found herself reluctant for the day to end. There was something refreshing about Jake's company: his lack of pretense, his genuine interest in her thoughts, the quiet confidence he exuded without arrogance. "Thank you for today," she said as they mounted their horses, "for helping me understand my father's work better." "It was my pleasure," Jake replied, his smile warming his eyes. "Though I have a confession to make, I had an ulterior motive in arranging this excursion." Adelaide raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The church social is happening this Saturday," he continued. "A spring celebration with food, music, dancing. I was hoping you might consider attending." With me. The invitation was clearly more personal than their dinner had been, a public declaration of interest rather than a neighborly gesture. Adelaide felt a flutter of both excitement and hesitation. She was still in mourning, technically, though frontier customs were less rigid than those in Boston. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. I understand if it seems too soon after your father's passing. In Boston, there would be certain expectations about a proper mourning period. Adelaide considered this. My father was never one for rigid social conventions. I think he would understand that life continues, even in grief. She met Jake's hopeful gaze. I would be honored to attend the social with you, Jake. His smile in response was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then it's settled. I'll call for you at 6 on Saturday. The ride back to town was filled with lighter conversation and occasional comfortable silences. Adelaide found herself studying Jake's profile when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of smiles and squinting into the sun, the capable hands that held the reins with unconscious skill. She was attracted to him, she realized, with a mixture of surprise and acceptance. It seemed both utterly unexpected and somehow inevitable, like the natural conclusion to the story that had begun in the churchyard when he'd found her crying and stayed until she could face the world again. What would come of this attraction, Adelaide couldn't say. Her future remained uncertain, whether she would stay in Cottonwood Springs or return east, what would become of her father's claim, how she would support herself long-term. But for now, the prospect of Saturday's social gave her something to anticipate with pleasure rather than dread, and that itself felt like a gift. As they reached the boarding house, and Jake helped her dismount, his hands lingering just a moment at her waist, Adelaide knew that something significant had shifted between them. The connection that had begun in shared grief was evolving into something deeper, something with the potential for joy. Until Saturday, Jake said softly, his blue eyes holding hers. Until Saturday, Adelaide echoed, a gentle smile curving her lips. The days leading up to the church social passed in a flurry of activity for Adelaide. News arrived from Laramie more quickly than expected. Jake's foreman had encountered the assayer on the road, eliminating the need for a lengthy wait. The results were promising enough to raise eyebrows. The samples contained silver in quantities that, while not spectacular, were certainly commercially viable if the vein continued as it appeared to. This changes things, Jake told her when he delivered the news. They were sitting in Mrs. Evans's parlor, the landlady discreetly absent but undoubtedly listening from the kitchen. Whitaker's offer of $50 was an insult. This claim could be worth considerably more. Adelaide studied the assayer's report. What would you advise? Jake considered carefully before answering. You have options. You could sell to a mining company for a fair price, not Whitaker's associates, but there are others. You could lease the claim, taking a percentage of any ore extracted, or you could hire workers to develop it yourself, though that requires capital and expertise. I lack both, Adelaide admitted. There's no rush to decide, Jake assured her. The important thing is that Whitaker doesn't try to pressure you into a hasty sale. As if summoned by their conversation, Mr. Whitaker appeared at the boarding house the following day, his thin face pinched with what seemed like irritation beneath a veneer of politeness. Miss Montgomery, he greeted her stiffly in Mrs. Evans's parlor. I understand you've had samples from your father's claim assessed in Laramie. Adelaide maintained a composed expression, though she was surprised by his knowledge. News travels quickly, Mr. Whitaker. Cottonwood Springs is a small community, he replied, adjusting his spectacles. I'm concerned that you're receiving advice from individuals who may not have your best interests at heart. Jake Callahan has been nothing but helpful, Adelaide stated firmly. Whitaker's mouth tightened. Callahan is a rancher, not a mining expert, and he has his own interests in the region. He leaned forward. Miss Montgomery, I'm prepared to increase my offer for your father's claim to $100, a generous sum considering the uncertainty of mining ventures. Adelaide met his gaze steadily. That's very kind, Mr. Whitaker, but I'm not ready to sell at present. I'm still considering my options. The assayer's expression hardened. I would caution you against delay. Mining claims require maintenance and development. The territorial laws are quite clear. A claim left unworked can be challenged. The implied threat was not subtle. Adelaide felt a flicker of anger but kept her voice level. I'm aware of the regulations, Mr. Whitaker. The claim will not be abandoned. After Whitaker departed, visibly displeased, Mrs. Evans emerged from the kitchen where she had undoubtedly been listening. That man, she huffed, setting down a tea tray with unnecessary force. Always trying to buy up everything and everyone, your father stood firm against him for years. She poured tea with a steady hand despite her agitation. It's good to see you doing the same. Adelaide accepted the cup gratefully. I don't understand his urgency. The claim has been there for years. Mrs. Evans settled into her chair. Rumor has it that Eastern investors are planning a larger mining operation in these hills. Whitaker's been acquiring properties on their behalf. Your father's claim sits right in the middle of their intended development. This new information added another dimension to the situation. Adelaide sipped her tea thoughtfully, wondering if the investors knew something about the area's potential that made her father's claim particularly valuable. By Saturday, Adelaide had made no decisions about the claim but had set aside the matter temporarily in favor of preparing for the church social. Mrs. Evans helped her refresh her best dress, a forest green creation with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than Adelaide could have managed alone. You look lovely, dear, Mrs. Evans declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Jake Callahan won't know what hit him, Adelaide blushed. It's just a social gathering, Mrs. Evans. The older woman smiled knowingly. Of course it is. And I'm just a simple boarding house keeper, not a woman who's seen enough romance in her day to recognize it blooming right under her roof. When Jake arrived, his appreciative gaze confirmed Mrs. Evans's predictions. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, with a crisp white shirt and string tie. Adelaide couldn't help but notice how the formal attire, while slightly incongruous with his weathered features, only enhanced his natural dignity. You're a vision, Adelaide, he said simply, offering his arm. The church and adjacent yard had been transformed for the social. Lanterns hung from trees, tables laden with food lined one side of the yard, and a small area had been cleared for dancing, where a trio of local musicians was already playing a lively tune. As they entered, Adelaide was conscious of curious glances and whispered comments. Jake Callahan, escorting Thomas Montgomery's Eastern daughter, was clearly the subject of considerable interest. But the reception was warm. People she had met briefly at her father's funeral approached to offer more personal condolences and welcome her to the community. The evening unfolded pleasantly. They shared a meal of fried chicken, cornbread, and various dishes contributed by the townswomen. Jake introduced Adelaide to friends and acquaintances, including his ranch foreman, a taciturn man named Miller who seemed devoted to his employer. When the dancing began in earnest, Jake turned to Adelaide with a questioning look. Would you care to dance? I understand if you'd rather not, given your recent loss. Adelaide hesitated only briefly. Her father would not have wanted her to withdraw from life in her grief. I would love to dance. Jake proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer despite his imposing size. As he led her through a waltz, his hand warm at the small of her back, Adelaide found herself relaxing into the moment, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and music. You dance well for a cowboy, she teased lightly. Jake's eyes crinkled with amusement. My mother insisted I learn, said a man should know how to move with purpose whether on horseback or a dance floor. A wise woman. She was. A shadow crossed his face briefly. She passed when I was 15, typhoid. Adelaide's hand tightened on his shoulder in silent sympathy. You've known your share of loss. Most folks out here have, he replied. It's a hard country, beautiful but unforgiving. As they continued dancing, Adelaide became aware of a growing comfort in Jake's presence. It wasn't just attraction, though that certainly existed, but a sense of rightness, as if they fit together in some fundamental way that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. The evening progressed, and Adelaide found herself genuinely enjoying the community gathering. The people of Cottonwood Springs, initially strangers, were becoming familiar. She chatted with the Reverend's wife about the church gardens, discussed books with the schoolteacher, and laughed at the sheriff's dry humor. Later, as the night cooled and stars emerged in the clear sky, Jake suggested they take a walk. They strolled to the edge of the churchyard, where the sounds of the social faded slightly, allowing for more private conversation. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Jake asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "Very much," Adelaide replied honestly. "Everyone has been so welcoming. People respect you for how you've handled yourself since your father's passing, with dignity but without airs." He paused, looking out over the moonlit landscape. "And they see how you're considering his claim carefully, not rushing to decisions." "I still don't know what I'll do about it," she admitted. "Part of me feels I should sell it and return to Boston. It's the practical choice, but another part wants to honor your father's dream," Jake finished for her. "Yes, and perhaps." She hesitated, uncertain how to express the growing feeling that Cottonwood Springs was beginning to feel less like a temporary stop and more like a place where she might belong. Jake seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Adelaide, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I feel a connection to you that I can't explain. Or perhaps I can. You're brave, intelligent, compassionate. You face challenges directly. You're adapting to a world very different from the one you knew." Adelaide's heart quickened at his words and the warmth in his eyes. "I feel it too, Jake. This connection, it's unexpected but undeniable." He reached up to gently touch her cheek. "I don't want to rush you. You're still grieving, still finding your footing here, but I want you to know that I care for you deeply. And whatever you decide about your future, I hope I might be part of it." The moment hung between them, fragile and precious. Adelaide knew that her response would set the course for whatever might develop between them. She could be cautious, ask for time, maintain the polite distance that propriety might dictate given the recency of her father's death and their short acquaintance. Instead, she chose honesty. "When you found me in the churchyard that day, I was drowning in grief, unable to see any path forward. You didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward sympathy. You simply stayed, offering quiet strength when I needed it most." She took a deep breath. "I don't know what the future holds, Jake. But I know I want you in it." The smile that illuminated his face made her heart swell. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Jake lowered his head toward hers. Adelaide lifted her face to meet him, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. His hand cradled her cheek, as if she were something precious, and Adelaide felt a sense of homecoming she hadn't expected to find in this remote corner of Wyoming Territory. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers for a moment, both of them breathing in the significance of what had just occurred. It wasn't just a kiss, but a declaration of intent, a beginning. "We should return to the social," Adelaide finally said, though reluctantly. "Before we're missed," Jake nodded, offering his arm once more. As they walked back toward the lights and music, Adelaide felt a lightness in her spirit that had been absent since before her father's illness. Grief still lingered, as it would for a long time to come, but alongside it now bloomed something new and hopeful, the possibility of joy, of connection, of a future she hadn't imagined, but now found herself eagerly anticipating. The next few weeks unfolded in a pattern that gradually began to feel like a new normal for Adelaide. She divided her time between the boarding house, her father's cabin, and increasingly frequent visits to the Circle C ranch, where Jake proudly showed her the operation he had built. The ranch was modest by Wyoming standards, a main house built of logs, but with refinements that spoke of care and attention to detail. A bunkhouse for the handful of cowboys Jake employed. A barn, corrals, and outbuildings necessary for cattle ranching. What impressed Adelaide most was the evident respect his workers had for him, not fear or mere obedience, but genuine regard. Jake's fare, Miller, the foreman, told her during one visit as they watched Jake work with a young horse in the corral. "Expects a full day's work, but never asks a man to do something he wouldn't do himself. That's rare enough in a boss." Adelaide learned to ride properly, abandoning the side saddle for a regular Western saddle that Jake had adjusted to fit her smaller frame. She discovered an unexpected joy in the freedom of galloping across the open grassland, the wind in her face, and Daisy, whom she had purchased from the livery stable owner, responding eagerly to her increasingly confident commands. Jake was a patient teacher, whether showing her how to read the land for signs of water and shelter, how to identify the edible plants that grew wild in the region, or how to manage the finances of the ranch, a complex system of projections and calculations that belied his lack of formal education. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. Jake was scrupulously respectful of her reputation, always ensuring they had a chaperone when propriety demanded it, usually Mrs. Evans or one of the ranch hands at a discreet distance. But he was also openly affectionate in ways that left no doubt about his feelings. A touch of his hand at her waist, a lingering glance across a room, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name, all conveyed the growing depth of his emotions. For Adelaide, the discovery of romantic love in the midst of grief was both surprising and healing. She had known affection before, even mild infatuation, but never this profound connection that seemed to encompass body, mind, and spirit. Jake saw her completely, her strengths and vulnerabilities, her moments of courage and moments of doubt, and cherished all of her. The matter of her father's mining claim remained unresolved, though not for lack of interest from various parties. Word of the promising assay results had spread, and Adelaide received several offers, each more generous than Whitaker's. The most intriguing came from a mining engineer named Hargrove, who proposed a partnership rather than an outright purchase. "Your father's claim shows real potential," Hargrove explained when they met at the boarding house, Jake present at Adelaide's request. "But developing it properly requires capital and expertise. I can provide both in exchange for a 50% interest." "And Miss Montgomery would retain ownership of her half," Jake clarified, his protective instincts evident. "Full ownership," Hargrove confirmed, "with quarterly distributions of any profits. I've prepared detailed projections based on the assay results and my examination of similar formations in the region." The proposal was tempting, offering Adelaide a potential income without requiring her to sell the claim outright. But it also meant committing to staying in Cottonwood Springs, at least for the foreseeable future. "I need time to consider it," she told Hargrove. After he departed, Jake asked the question that hung between them. "Is staying here something you're considering more seriously now?" Adelaide met his gaze directly. "It is, for multiple reasons." His smile told her he understood that he was among those reasons. "I'm glad to hear it, though I want you to know that whatever you decide about the claim, whatever you decide about us, I support your choice. Your happiness matters to me, Adelaide, even if that means returning east." His selflessness only confirmed what she already knew, that Jake Callahan was a man of exceptional character, someone who would put her needs above his own desires. It made her love him all the more. As spring gave way to early summer, Adelaide made her decision. She accepted Hargrove's partnership proposal, with minor adjustments to the terms that Jake helped her negotiate. The development of the claim would begin immediately, with the first shaft following the promising vein her father had discovered. With her future in Cottonwood Springs now more certain, Adelaide took steps to establish herself in the community beyond her identity as Thomas Montgomery's daughter. When she learned that the town's schoolteacher was leaving to be married, Adelaide applied for the position, her experience in Boston making her the most qualified candidate. The school board, consisting of the reverend, the bank manager, and 2 prominent ranchers, approved her appointment with enthusiasm. She would begin teaching in September when the school term resumed. In late June, nearly 3 months after her father's passing, Jake invited Adelaide for a special dinner at the Circle C. He was unusually secretive about the occasion, asking only that she wear her finest dress and arrive by mid-afternoon. When she reached the ranch, Adelaide was surprised to find the main house transformed. Wildflowers filled every available container. The rough-hewn dining table was set with what appeared to be Jake's best china and silver, and something delicious was cooking in the kitchen. "Jake," she called, entering the main room where they usually sat during her visits. He emerged from the kitchen, dressed in a suit she hadn't seen before, his face freshly shaven and his dark hair neatly combed. The sight of him made her heart skip a beat, as it often did, but his evident nervousness piqued her curiosity. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hands and kissing her cheek. "Thank you for coming. I wouldn't have missed it, though I'm still wondering what we're celebrating." Jake smiled enigmatically. "All in good time. Would you like to see something first? I've made some changes to the house." He led her through to the back of the house, to a room she hadn't entered before. When he opened the door, Adelaide gasped in surprise. The formerly empty space had been transformed into a library, with bookshelves lining the walls and a comfortable reading chair positioned near the window. A small writing desk stood in one corner. "Jake, this is wonderful," she exclaimed, moving to examine the shelves. Many contained books she recognized from his previous collection. But there were new additions as well, several novels she had mentioned enjoying, some educational texts, and surprisingly, a collection of poetry. "I wanted to create a space that might feel like home to you," Jake said, watching her reaction carefully. "Somewhere you could read, write letters, prepare lessons for your students." The implication of his words, that he was creating a place for her in his home, in his life, made Adelaide's pulse quicken. She turned to face him, finding him much closer than she'd expected. "Adelaide," he began, his voice low and earnest. "These past months have been the most meaningful of my life. Getting to know you, seeing your strength and grace in the face of loss, watching you build a new life here, it's been a privilege." He took her hands in his blue eyes holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I know it hasn't been long by some standards, and if you need more time, I understand, but I can't imagine my life without you in it." Then, still holding her hands, Jake knelt before her on one knee. "Adelaide Montgomery, I love you with all my heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to suspect the purpose of this special evening, the reality of the moment, Jake kneeling before her, his face open and vulnerable with love, overwhelmed Adelaide with emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, but unlike those Jake had first witnessed in the churchyard, these were born of joy rather than grief. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Jake, I would be honored to be your wife." His face transformed with happiness as he rose to his feet. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a ring with a modest but beautifully cut diamond set in gold. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found a woman who made me feel the way my mother made him feel." His voice roughened with emotion. "I've been carrying it in my pocket since the church social, waiting for the right moment." Adelaide looked down at the ring, then back up at the man who had just pledged his life to hers. "It's perfect, Jake, and so is this moment." He gathered her into his arms then, kissing her with a depth of feeling that left no doubt about the strength of his love. Adelaide responded in kind, pouring her own love into the embrace. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you that Miller and the boys know about this. They've been helping me prepare. They're probably watching from the bunkhouse window right now, waiting to see if you said yes." Adelaide laughed, her happiness too great to contain. "Then perhaps we should let them know." Hand in hand, they stepped onto the porch. Sure enough, several figures stood outside the bunkhouse, trying unsuccessfully to appear as if they weren't watching the main house. Jake raised Adelaide's hand, the ring catching the late afternoon sunlight. A cheer erupted from the Cowboys, hats thrown into the air in celebration. Adelaide blushed but waved back, touched by their evident approval and good wishes. The evening that followed was one Adelaide knew she would remember all her life. They shared the special dinner Jake had prepared with some assistance from Mrs. Evans, he admitted, and talked long into the night about their plans for the future. They would be married in the church in Cottonwood Springs, with Reverend Holloway officiating. Jake wanted Miller to stand as his best man, while Adelaide would ask Mrs. Evans to be her matron of honor. "What about the timing?" Jake asked. "I know traditionally there would be a longer mourning period before a wedding." Adelaide considered this. My father would want my happiness above adherence to convention, and here in the West, practical considerations often outweigh formal customs. She smiled. Besides, I think we've proven our feelings go beyond a passing infatuation. They settled on a date in August, before the school term began, and while the weather would still permit an outdoor celebration afterward. As Jake escorted her back to the boarding house late that evening, the stars overhead seemed especially bright, as if nature itself was blessing their union. Mrs. Evans was waiting up, of course, her knowing smile indicating she had been well aware of Jake's intentions. Her delight at seeing the ring on Adelaide's finger and the happiness radiating from the couple was genuine and heartfelt. "Your father would be so pleased," she told Adelaide after Jake had departed with a lingering goodnight kiss. "He always spoke highly of Jake, said he was one of the few men around here with both backbone and heart." That night, as Adelaide prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. She had arrived in Cottonwood Springs broken with grief, expecting nothing more than to bid farewell to her father and return to her solitary life in Boston. Instead, she had found a community, a purpose, and most unexpectedly, a love that promised to sustain her through whatever joys and sorrows the future might hold. As she drifted towards sleep, Adelaide's thoughts turned to that first meeting in the churchyard, when a kind cowboy had found her crying and stayed until she could face the world again. How could she have known then that his steadfast presence in that moment of despair would lead to a lifetime of happiness? The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Adelaide, with Mrs. Evans's help, transformed her best dress into a wedding gown by adding lace from her mother's veil, which she had brought with her from Boston. The boarding house became the center of activity as the women of Cottonwood Springs contributed their skills sewing, baking, arranging flowers to ensure the day would be perfect. Jake, meanwhile, made improvements to the ranch house, adding a larger bedroom with a private sitting area and expanding the kitchen. He consulted Adelaide on every decision, making it clear that this would be their home together, not just his house where she would live. News from the mining claim was promising. Hargrove's development work had exposed a vein richer than initially estimated, and the first profit distribution, though modest, confirmed that Adelaide's decision to maintain ownership had been sound. Combined with her teacher's salary, it meant she would contribute financially to their marriage, a point of pride for her independent spirit. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect Wyoming August morning. Adelaide prepared at the boarding house, surrounded by the women who had become her friends. Mrs. Evans fastened the last buttons of her gown, then stepped back with tears in her eyes. "You're radiant, my dear," she said, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Adelaide's upswept hair. "Absolutely radiant." When it was time, they made their way to the church, where it seemed the entire population of Cottonwood Springs had gathered. The small building couldn't contain everyone, so many stood outside, peering through the windows or waiting to offer congratulations afterward. As Adelaide entered on the arm of the bank manager, who had offered to give her away, she saw Jake waiting at the altar beside Reverend Holloway. His face, when he turned and saw her, reflected such profound love and wonder that Adelaide felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. The ceremony was simple, but deeply meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to honor, support, and cherish each other through all of life's seasons. When Jake placed the gold band he had selected to accompany her engagement ring on her finger, his hands were steady, but his voice roughened with emotion. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, the traditional words carrying the weight of his commitment. At the Reverend's proclamation that they were husband and wife, Jake kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the man he was: passionate but gentle, strong but never domineering. The celebration that followed on the church grounds was joyous and heartfelt. Tables groaned with food contributed by community members, musicians played lively tunes that had couples dancing on the grass, and children ran about with the exuberance of youth. Adelaide found herself welcomed not just as Jake Callahan's bride, but as a valued member of Cottonwood Springs in her own right. As the afternoon waned, they prepared to depart for the Circle C, which would now be their shared home. Goodbyes were said, well wishes received, and finally, Jake helped Adelaide into the buggy he had decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. As they drove away, Adelaide looked back at the gathered community, then at the churchyard where their story had begun. It seemed fitting that their journey together had started in a place of endings and was now continuing in a celebration of beginnings. "Happy, Mrs. Callahan?" Jake asked, his smile warming her heart. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied, leaning against his shoulder as they headed toward home and the future they would build together. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges, as all lives do. Adelaide proved to be a beloved teacher, her Eastern education and genuine care for her students elevating the small school to new standards of excellence. Jake's ranch prospered under their joint management, with Adelaide's organizational skills complementing his practical knowledge of cattle and land. The mining claim continued to produce modest but steady returns, eventually funding the construction of a new schoolhouse for Cottonwood Springs. Adelaide insisted it include a proper library, named in her father's memory. Their greatest happiness came with the birth of their children, first a son they named Thomas, after Adelaide's father, and 2 years later, a daughter they called Elizabeth, after Jake's mother. Both children inherited their father's love of the land and their mother's thirst for knowledge, growing into capable, compassionate individuals who would eventually make their own contributions to the community. Whitaker eventually left Cottonwood Springs after his mining interests were consolidated under new ownership. The town grew slowly but steadily, maintaining its character as a place where neighbors knew and helped one another. Adelaide and Jake marked the passing years with quiet celebrations of their anniversary, often returning to the churchyard where they had first met. What had once been a place of sorrow became, over time, a place of reflection and gratitude. On their 25th anniversary, they stood together by Thomas Montgomery's grave, now marked with a proper headstone and surrounded by carefully tended flowers. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't come to the churchyard that day? Adelaide asked, her hand comfortably entwined with Jake's. The years had added silver to her chestnut hair and lines of experience to her face, but her eyes remained as bright and perceptive as when they'd first met. Jake, similarly touched by time but still strong and vital, considered her question. "Sometimes, but I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be." Adelaide smiled, thinking of all they had shared, the laughter and tears, the worries and triumphs, the quiet, everyday moments that formed the foundation of a life well lived together. "I believe you're right," she said softly. "Some things are indeed meant to be." As they walked back toward town, toward the home and family they had built together, Adelaide reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place and this life. What had begun in grief had blossomed into a happiness deeper and more enduring than she could have imagined on that long-ago day, when a kind cowboy had found her crying in the churchyard and stayed until she smiled again. It hadn't been just a smile he had restored, but the capacity for joy itself, a gift she had spent a lifetime gratefully returning.